U.S.-Israel defense cooperation should be driven by the enhancement of the mutually beneficial win-win two-way street ties, not by the reintroduction of one-way street relations, which would burden the U.S. and increase the dependency of Israel upon the U.S. The proposal to extend to Israel U.S. security guarantees, including a defense pact and peacekeeping force, in exchange for Israel's retreat from the historically and militarily critical dominant mountain ridges of Judea and Samaria, ignores the inherently ineffective track record of such open-ended U.S. guarantees. The provisions of the U.S. Constitution, which enables U.S. presidents to avoid full implementation of the guarantees, and the U.S. public opposition, especially since the military involvement in Vietnam and then Iraq and Afghanistan, to the stationing of U.S. troops abroad. According to a November 15, 2001, Department of Justice memo to the White House National Security Council, irrespective of international law and consistent with the U.S. Constitution, the President has the constitutional discretionary authority to terminate or suspend unilaterally, fully or partly, the 1972 USA-USSR ABM Treaty, the limitation of anti-ballistic missile systems, without seeking coordination with Congress, and certainly not with the USSR, whenever the President determines that it is in the national interest to do so. In 1979, President Carter unilaterally abrogated the Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan upon the establishment of diplomatic relations with China. Such a presidential prerogative was also asserted by Presidents Madison, McKinley, Wilson, Coolidge, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and recently by Presidents Carter and Reagan. Thus, in 1986, Reagan suspended the ANZUS, Australia, New Zealand, USA, Pact security obligations to New Zealand. And in 1985, he terminated the Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation with Nicaragua. The London Economist wrote on March 9, 2015, Article 5 of the NATO Treaty stipulates that the response to aggression against member state may include armed forces, but it does not mandate it. All that NATO actually promises is to take such action as it deems necessary to restore and maintain security. That could be anything from nuclear war to a stiff diplomatic protest. The Baltics argue that an attack on them would mean an all-out East-West confrontation. But Article 5 does not specify such a response. Many Eastern NATO members worry, since it is hard to imagine a U.S. president risking nuclear war to defend a tiny country half a world away. What might count locally as an intolerable assault on the Baltic states' sovereignty may not be seen in NATO headquarters as an armed attack. All the strength of the world's mightiest military alliance will not amount to much if its members cannot agree when an aggressor has actually stepped over the line. According to Hebrew University professor of international relations Mishla Pomerantz, a treaty can never entail more than a contingent and tentative promise to use force in the future. Execution of the promise requires further specific authorization by Congress. Otherwise, the treaty makers, the President and 2/3 of the Senate, would be unconstitutionally usurping the war-making powers of Congress according to the 1973 War Powers Act, which passed over a presidential veto. Past American defense commitments are generally characterized by vagueness, non-specificity, and the explicit denial of any automatic obligation to use force. to keep the U.S. options open and its absolute discretion intact in deciding whether and how to redeem its promise. In 1967, President Johnson invoked constitutional and congressional noncompliance with the 1957 Eisenhower's Dallas assurances to Israel in response to Egyptian violations of the ceasefire and demilitarization accords. Johnson said, "I'm a tall Texan, but without Congress, I'm a short president." Any commitment must be interpreted and applied by the president, and the line between interpretation and breach, evasion, and non-execution may be very thin indeed. What constitutes interpretation for the promisor may well be seen as breach by the promisee. Evasion by means of interpretation would not be a difficult task. Recent legislative restrictions on presidential war-making could readily be cited as additional justification for non-execution or evasion. The violation of international law by the U.S. president is not prescribed by the Constitution. A president's decision to execute or not to execute an international commitment depends on his own, not the promisee's, assessment of the domestic and international political and military environment. Every U.S. international commitment allows for future non-implementation, consistent with U.S. interest and the U.S. Constitution. Against the backdrop of the U.S. Constitution and past U.S. security guarantees and defense pacts, it is clear that U.S. security guarantees, with or without troops on Israel's borders, in exchange for Israel's withdrawal from the dominant mountain ridges of Judea and Samaria, would create a short-term false sense of peace and security while dramatically eroding Israel's posture of deterrence in the Middle East, transforming Israel's image in the U.S. from a role model of strategic ally to a feeble dependent, undermining U.S.-Israel relations, injuring U.S. reliability and power projection, and therefore fueling Middle East turbulence, damaging U.S. interest, and causing another setback to the cause of peace. The next video will highlight the systematic blunders of the Department of State, Foggy Bottom.